I only needed somewhere to sleep, and then I heard something beneath that old bench.
No diploma, no bedroom, no plan. Just a canvas tool roll and $1 she had kept from her grandfather's old workbench drawer. And with that dollar, she bought a brass telescope tube forge, abandoned outside Williams Bay, Walworth County, Wisconsin. Since 1987, half the skylights were shattered. Vines had pushed through the east wall. The county condemned it in October 2021 and marked it for demolition the following spring. But beneath its massive brass drawing bench sat a locked iron compartment no inspector had opened in decades, holding something that would alter the shape of her life. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Stella Maren had been measuring her whole life without knowing it. As a child in Madison, she measured mornings by her mother's shoes in the hallway and afternoons by pages left in science books. At 9, she knew the bones of the hand. At 12, she knew which grades earned praise and which earned silence. Her future had always been presented as something already written. Her mother, Evelyn, believed uncertainty was carelessness. She labeled pantry jars, paid bills early, and kept Stella's report cards in clear sleeves. When people asked what her daughter would become, she said physician with the certainty of a train schedule. Only her grandfather, Amos Maren, taught her that exactness could serve wonder instead of fear. On Saturdays, he drove her to his instrument shop, where he repaired optical mounts and old scopes. At the rear bench, he kept cartridge brass, steel dies, beeswax, calipers, and a hand-cranked draw plate blackened by use. Stella learned to anneal brass until it softened toward a dull cherry glow. Let it cool, coat it lightly, and draw it through a die without twisting. Amos never hurried the pull. He watched the metal as if it were answering him. Force makes the bad tube. Patience makes it true. At 10, Stella heard a workshop rule. Years later, she understood he had meant nearly everything. Amos died during her first semester of medical school. By the time Stella came home, his shop had been cleared. The draw plate, micrometers, gauge blocks, even the dented blue stool were gone. She found only his canvas tool roll in a box and, tucked inside one pocket, a worn dollar bill folded twice. She returned to school because returning was easier than deciding. By her third year, sleep had narrowed to 3 or 4 hours. She began standing outside lecture halls, unable to enter. She missed 2 clinical rotations. The dean suggested leave. Evelyn called it quitting. At home, every conversation became an inspection. When would she return? What had she applied for? What had she accomplished that day? Her mother never shouted. She simply removed every soft place where uncertainty might rest. The eviction happened on a gray Thursday in March. Stella returned carrying a paper cup of cold coffee. Her key entered the lock, but would not turn. On the porch sat Amos's tool roll, her winter coat, and a grocery bag holding socks, 2 shirts, and a toothbrush. Through the narrow glass beside the door, her mother stood in the hallway. Stella knocked once. Evelyn opened the inner door, but left the storm door latched. "You chose failure. I cannot carry this any more." 8 words. Stella looked at the brass latch between them. Her mother did not unlock it, lift the grocery bag, or ask where she would sleep. After several seconds, Evelyn lowered her eyes to the floor. That small movement was more final than anger. Stella picked up the bag. For 6 weeks she moved through southern Wisconsin by the cheapest route she could manage. 2 nights were spent upright in a Madison bus station before a guard moved her on. She paid $28. for one Rockford motel night after freezing rain soaked her coat. In Janesville, she slept 4 nights in the back seat of a woman's Buick behind a church pantry. In Delavan, she used a 24-hour laundromat until the attendant began locking the restroom after midnight. Her money fell from $312 to $186, then $91. She learned hunger by its sequence: sharpness first, then irritability, then a quiet in which the smell of toasted bread could occupy the whole mind. She bought peanut butter, crackers, bruised bananas, and coffee only when warmth mattered more than the coins. At $43, she entered the Barrett Memorial Library in Williams Bay because the wind off Geneva Lake had turned wet and hard. At a computer near the back, she searched county surplus listings for caretaker work or abandoned structures. One notice had been scanned crookedly from a legal sheet. Former brass telescope tube forge, uninhabitable, condemned, transfer price, one with assumption of liability. There was a parcel number, a deadline, and a note that the county preferred transfer to demolition if a responsible claimant appeared before spring contracting. Stella read it twice, then searched the address. The satellite image showed a narrow brick roof among walnut trees, less than 2 miles from Yerkes Observatory. The listing mentioned no plumbing, no certified heat, and no guarantee that the well still worked. She touched the edge of Amos's canvas tool roll beneath the desk. At closing time, Stella printed the notice for 15 cents. Outside, rain moved across the library windows in silver lines. She had $38.85 left, one bus connection she could afford, and no reason to return east. The next morning, she folded the county notice into her coat pocket and started toward the forge. By sunset, she would learn whether $1 could buy a door no one else wanted to open. The bus left Williams Bay before noon with Stella sitting 3 rows behind the driver, Amos's tool roll between her boots and the county notice folded inside her coat. She rode only as far as the route allowed, then walked the remaining 4.5 miles beneath a low Wisconsin sky. By dusk, the temperature had fallen to 29 degrees F. She spent that night in the open side of an unused hay barn, wrapped in her coat beneath the sweet, dry smell of Old Timothy, listening to mice work somewhere behind the stacked bales. Morning brought hard frost and a pale sun. Williams Bay was already awake when she came down Geneva Street. Miller's Market setting, produce crates outside, Bayview Cafe steaming its front windows, Nelson Hardware raising a striped awning, Hartwell Pharmacy switching on its sign, and a narrow place called Lakeside Barbershop sweeping yesterday's hair from the threshold. Stella passed all 5 without stopping. She had $7 in her pocket she was willing to spend, and 31 he was not. The Walworth County Clerk's satellite office occupied 2 rooms in a municipal building with beige brick and a flag rope knocking steadily against the pole outside. Inside, the heat felt almost excessive. A woman behind the counter wore silver reading glasses on a chain and had one thumbnail permanently darkened by blue carbon paper. Her brass nameplate read, Margaret Fenn, Deputy Clerk. Stella placed the printed listing on this counter. Mrs. Fenn read the parcel number and looked up. "You are here, about the forge?" "Yes, ma'am." The clerk opened a folder thick enough to have become soft at the corners. "You understand, there is no occupancy certificate?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the electrical service has been disconnected?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the county makes no representation about the well, chimney, foundation, or roof?" "Yes, ma'am." "And you understand demolition becomes your responsibility once the deed transfers?" Stella looked at the dollar bill she had taken from Amos's tool roll that morning. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Fenn watched her for a moment longer, then turned the papers around. There were 7 places to initial and 3 signatures. Stella wrote slowly. The pen dragged slightly over the duplicate sheets. When she finished, Mrs. Fenn carried the deed to a side desk, pressed a brass county stamp into a black pad, and brought it down with one deliberate strike. The sound was small. Still, Stella felt it in her chest. Mrs. Fenn took the dollar, flattened it beneath her palm, and clipped it to the transfer receipt, rather than putting it in the cash drawer. "You will go west on Geneva Street," she said, "past the Observatory Road, then take the gravel lane after the old pump house. There is no mailbox anymore. If you reach the marsh bridge, you have gone too far." She began closing the folder, then stopped. "Maren." Stella looked up. The clerk had opened the deed again and was studying Stella's signature. "Was Amos Maren related to you?" "My grandfather?" Mrs. Fenn removed her glasses. For the first time that morning, her official expression loosened. "He worked out here." Stella said nothing. "Not in that building full-time. At least I do not think so. But I remember his name on deliveries when I was young. Optical brass. Telescope fittings. My father hauled freight for the observatory, and used to mention a Mr. Maren who could judge a tube by rolling it on a stone table." Stella's hand settled on the canvas roll. "He never told me." People often leave out the part they think everyone already knows. Mrs. Fenn looked toward a filing cabinet against the far wall. There were several little instrument shops around the lake once. Most were never grand enough to make history books. They made collars, sleeves, tubes, brackets, pieces other people put their names on. She returned her glasses to her nose. "The forge may be worse than the photographs." "I understand. I believe you do." Mrs. Fenn slid the stamped deed across the counter. Outside, the wind had turned south. Stella followed Geneva Street west until the buildings thinned and the ground opened toward bare fields and lake country. A man repairing fence wire raised 2 fingers from the other side of the road. Beside him, a yellow farm dog barked once, decided Stella was uninteresting, and returned to sniffing a ditch. The gravel lane appeared almost exactly where Mrs. Fenn had said it would. Black walnut trees stood on both sides, their branches empty and angular against the March light. Last year's husks had stained the ground dark beneath them. Stella walked another quarter-mile before the forge came into view. It was narrower than she had imagined. Perhaps 24 feet wide and 60 feet long, built of red brick gone nearly brown with age. The roof pitched shallowly beneath sheets of old standing seam metal. Several sections buckled around the shattered skylights. A square brick chimney rose from the rear third, missing its cap. Across the front, a faded wooden board still carried fragments of gold lettering. Williams Bay, drawn brass worksa, vine, as thick as Stella's wrist, entered through a mortar joint on the east wall. She stood at the doorway with the deed in one hand. Then she pushed. The swollen oak door resisted until her shoulder broke the seal of dirt beneath it. It opened 6 inches, then a foot, releasing a smell of rust, old soot, damp wood, and the mineral cold of a building shut through too many winters. Inside, broken glass cracked under her shoes. The front room held an iron stove, a scarred desk, and racks along one wall where circular steel dies still hung like dark coins. Wind entered through the skylight and moved a strip of paper across the floor. Somewhere above her, loose metal tapped at a steady interval. She tasted dust when she breathed through her mouth. The back room was colder. There stood this drawing bench. Its cast-iron carriage ran nearly 12 feet along a heavy timber frame. A hand wheel wider than Stella's shoulders remained fixed at one end, orange rust blooming around its hub. Beyond it were rollers, a vise, and a long, polished surface protected beneath grime. Stella ran one finger across the edge. Under the dirt, the metal was smooth. Very smooth. Her grandfather's shop returned not as a memory, but as a physical sensation. Beeswax on her fingertips, the drag of brass through a die, Amos saying nothing until a pull was finished. She withdrew her hand. Not today. There was too much else to solve. She found a hand pump behind the building, but the handle moved without resistance. The outhouse leaned 5 degrees toward the marsh. One rear window still had intact glass. She stuffed rags into the worst gaps around it and swept a rectangle of floor with a broom she found behind the desk. By dark, the temperature inside had fallen close to the temperature outside. Her dinner was half a sleeve of crackers and the last bruised banana from her bag. She spread her coat beneath her rather than over herself, because the brick floor pulled warmth from her body faster than the air did. Amos's tool roll became a pillow. Through the broken skylight above, a narrow piece of the night remained visible. The stars were sharper here than they had ever looked through the apartment windows in Madison. For nearly an hour, Stella listened to the forge, metal contracting, a branch brushing brick, water moving somewhere beyond the walnuts. Once, a small animal crossed the front room and disappeared beneath the drawing bench. She did not sleep much, but sometime after midnight, with her stamped deed folded beneath her hand and the old machinery waiting in the darkness around her, Stella understood that for the first time in months, she was not sleeping somewhere. She had permission to leave. She was sleeping somewhere. She had permission to stay. Sometimes, you have to break your own world to see the stars clearly. For the first 3 days, Stella learned the forge by using it. The hand pump behind the building needed priming. She poured 2 jars of water into the head, worked the iron handle 37 times, and finally heard the deep, hollow gulp of a pipe taking hold. The first water came brown. The second bucket cleared enough for washing. The outhouse was less cooperative. One floorboard had rotted through beside the bench, so she laid a scrap plank across it and marked the weak spot with white chalk. At night, she learned the floorboards by sound. The front room gave one long complaint near the stove. The hall creaked twice beside the brick partition. The workroom had a single sharp note near the east wall, like a knuckle striking a hollow box. On the 4th morning, she walked back to Nelson Hardware. The owner was a broad man in his late 60s named Walter Nelson, with one eyebrow that had gone white, while the other remained brown. His store smelled of machine oil, cedar shelving, rope, and the faint, peppery dust of old cardboard cartons. Stella placed a chimney brush, stove cement, lamp oil, and 2 boxes of nails on the counter. Walter looked at the money in her palm. "That all you have?" For today, he removed 1 box of nails from the total. "You own the old brass place?" She nodded. "My grandfather used to buy draw grease here." Walter studied her face, then reached beneath the register and brought out a thin paperback with a cracked yellow cover. "Home repair for old buildings. Previous owner never came back for it. I cannot pay for that. You are not." He opened a small, ruled ledger. "I can give you 30 days. No interest. Do not make me regret being sentimental." Stella hesitated. "How much?" $50. She signed the account. Chimney brush cost $8.75. Stove cement was $4.20. A gallon of kerosene was $3.60. 2 pounds of cut nails came to $5.40. A length of sash cord was £2.15. Walter added a pair of used leather gloves without writing them down. Back at the forge, Stella began with the chimney. She removed the stovepipe first, carrying it outside so the loosened soot would not fall into the room. Then she tied the round wire brush to a weighted rope, climbed onto the low rear roof and fed it down from the top. The first pass stopped 6 feet below the crown. She pulled upward, rotated the brush, lowered it again, and struck something hard. Creosote. Not the light gray powder of ordinary soot, but black glazed deposits, brittle at the edges and thick enough to narrow the flue. She worked from above for 2 hours, then from below with a shorter rod. Each section that broke free fell with a dry rush into the firebox. By noon, her face was streaked black. By 3, her shoulders shook each time she lifted the brush. She filled nearly half a galvanized bucket with soot, bird nesting, mortar crumbs, and hard flakes of creosote before daylight finally appeared, when she held a mirror at the bottom of the flue. 5 hours and 40 minutes. She waited another hour before testing it. The first fire was deliberately small: 3 twists of newspaper, 6 pieces of dry walnut kindling, 2 narrow splits of oak. Smoke lifted cleanly through the throat of the stove instead of rolling back into the room. Stella watched for 10 minutes before adding another piece. Then she boiled water in a dented enamel saucepan and ate noodles with salt while sitting on the floor. Steam clouded the nearest pane. It was the first hot meal she had cooked for herself in weeks. She did not celebrate it. She simply held the bowl with both hands until the heat reached her fingers. The following day, she began taking stock of the workroom. She found 7 things worth keeping: a rack of hardened steel dies, each stamped with an internal diameter, a bench micrometer in a walnut case, 2 brass mandrels, almost 4 feet long, a leather apron stiffened by age, a box of beeswax cakes wrapped in paper, a hand vise with jaws polished bright at their centers, and beneath a canvas sheet near the west wall, 3 unfinished brass tube sections nested one inside another. The drawing bench remained the largest object in the room. Stella cleaned it last. The cast iron carriage rode on 2 rails and had once been pulled by a rack and pinion gear. She brushed rust from the hand wheel, oiled the shaft, and spent almost an hour freeing the first inch of movement. The carriage moved grudgingly, then another inch. Something inside the base shifted, not a scrape, a knock. Stella stopped. She pushed the carriage back. Knock, forward, knock. She crouched beside the iron base and tapped it with the wooden handle of a screwdriver. The left side rang dense. The center rang dense. Near the rear foot, the sound changed. Hollow. She moved the screwdriver 2 inches. Dense again. The hollow section was no wider than her hand. There were no hinges. No visible seam. She fetched the micrometer case and used its brass rule along the bottom edge. One section of the base sat slightly proud of the surrounding casting, less than a 1/16 of an inch. She cleaned the grease away with kerosene. A circle appeared, not iron. Cedar. It had been painted black to match the base, then pressed flush into a recess. Stella used the point of a small awl around its edge until the wood turned. The disc was threaded. 3 turns. 4. The cedar plug came free in her palm. Behind it was darkness. She inserted 2 fingers and touched cloth. The compartment extended nearly 18 inches into the carriage. She did not reach farther. Instead, she found a small mirror, angled it toward the opening, and brought her oil lamp close. Packages, several, wrapped in waxed paper and tied with cotton cord. She pulled them out one at a time and placed them on the drawing bench in the order they emerged. The first contained the set of small precision files, each handle marked with Amos's initials. The second held a brass vernier caliper, wrapped in flannel. The third was heavier. Inside lay 2 rolls of unused cartridge brass sheet, protected with oiled paper. Then came a narrow wooden case. Stella opened it. A brass spyglass rested inside, perhaps 14 inches long when closed, its tubes perfectly concentric and free of green corrosion. The draw seams were invisible. because there were no seams. She turned the focusing tube. It moved with the slow, smooth resistance of well-fitted brass. Beneath the spyglass was an envelope. She saw her grandfather's handwriting. She did not open it. There was still one package inside the carriage. This one was a rectangular tin box, its lid sealed with 2 strips of cloth tape gone brittle with age. Stella sat on the floor before cutting them. Inside were paper packets, coin rolls, and 4 cloth pouches. She opened the first pouch. Silver $50. The second contained Morgan dollars. The third held older gold coins, smaller and heavier than she expected. The fourth carried a mixture of mercury dimes and several worn quarters. Under them lay bundles of currency, folded flat between sheets of waxed paper. She counted twice, not quickly, bills first, then coins, then the figures again on the back of an old invoice. The total came to $58,000, exactly. Among the coins she found a 1921 Morgan silver dollar, a 1916 mercury dime, several Walking Liberty $50, and 2 small gold Indian headpieces wrapped separately in cotton. At the bottom of the tin was something that did not belong with money, a medal, bronze, suspended from a faded ribbon. World War I Victory Medal. 19, Stella held it by the edge. The medal was cold even after the room had warmed. She set it beside the spyglass. The envelope remained unopened. Outside, evening had begun to darken the marsh beyond the walnut trees. Stella put the money back into the tin. She returned the tools to their wrapping. She left only the envelope and the spyglass on the bench. Then she walked outside. The wind had stopped. Water beyond the property reflected a thin band of remaining light, broken only when a muskrat crossed near the reeds. Stella sat on the rear step until her fingers became cold. She did not read the letter. Not that night. Some things had already waited long enough that another 12 hours would not harm them. Sometimes you have to break your own world to see the stars clearly. Morning came pale and windless. Stella returned to the drawing bench before lighting the stove. The envelope still lay beside the spyglass, where she had left it. Its paper had yellowed at the edges, but the handwriting remained unmistakable. Amos's narrow capitals, each letter leaning slightly forward as though the words were already moving toward their destination. Her name was not on it. Only one line appeared across the front. For the one who finds the bench. She broke the seal carefully. My dear one, whoever you are. If you are reading this, then the carriage opened for you, which means either you were patient enough to notice its false weight or stubborn enough to keep listening after the machinery had stopped speaking plainly. Both are useful qualities. My name is Amos Maren. In February of 2018, Dr. Helen Strauss at University Hospital in Madison told me that the weakness in my hands was amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. She was honest with me. I respected her for it. She said I would likely lose the fine control required for optical work before I lost the ability to understand what needed doing. There are few harder things for a craftsman than to know the measure and no longer be able to hold it. So I have put certain things here. For whoever comes after, our family worked brass before it worked glass. Elias Maren began as an instrument fitter in Boston in 1869, then moved west in 1882. His son Thomas Maren came to Williams Bay in 1896 when telescope work around the lake needed men who understood drawn tube. Thomas's daughter Ruth Maren joined the shop in 1901 and became the better hand. Her son Samuel Maren worked here until 1947, and Samuel taught my father, Peter, who taught me. The trade closed on October 14, 1987. For more than 30 years afterward, This room stood quiet. That does not make the work dead. If you intend to draw brass again, remember 4 things. Anneal cartridge brass only until the surface reaches a dull red in low light, approximately 900 degree F. More heat will not make you wiser. For heavy wall tubing, reduce diameter in small stages. A draw reduction near 12% is safer than one heroic pull. Use beeswax sparingly on the die and mandrel. Too much lubricant lets the metal lie to your hands. After each draw, give the tube time to relax before measuring. 10 minutes can save an hour of correction. I learned these things from people who corrected me without humiliating me. That is rarer than skill. The metal in the box belonged to my grandfather Samuel's older brother, Stella Maren, who served with the American Expeditionary Forces in France during the First World War. He came home in 1919 with the medal and without his younger brother William, who died near the Meuse Argonne. Samuel kept both names in the shop ledger until the day he closed it. You will also find money. Do not mistake it for the inheritance. Money is stored labor. It may repair a roof, buy time, or keep hunger from making your decisions. Use it carefully. But the inheritance is the bench, the dies, the measurements written in margins, and the knowledge that someone before you worked slowly enough to leave something sound behind. A thing made exactly can outlive the person who made it. That is not immortality. It is responsibility. If you are related to me, I hope you were not told that there was only one respectable way to live. I made that mistake with people I loved. Precision can become another form of fear when we use it to keep life from changing. Is a brass marker behind the forge, near the 3rd walnut tree from the marsh. You will know it by the small star cut into its face. Beneath it is nothing valuable. I mention it because Ruth Maren put it there, and I promised myself her name would not be lost, simply because she was a woman working in a trade men preferred to remember as their own. If you are not family, the promise belongs to you anyway. Keep one thing, repair one thing, teach one thing, then leave the rest for someone whose hands you may never see. I hope the horizon is still visible from the rear step. I hope the roof still gives you at least one dry corner. And I hope whatever drove you here does not convince you that arriving here was the same thing as failing elsewhere. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Amos Peters, Strin, November 3rd, 2019. Stella read the letter once without moving. Then she read it again. On the second reading, she slowed at Ruth's name, tracing no words, touching only the empty margin beside them. When she finished, she folded the sheets along their original creases exactly as Amos had done, and returned them to the envelope. The 3rd walnut tree from the marsh stood behind the forge where spring weeds had flattened beneath winter snow. Stella counted twice. At its base, nearly hidden under leaf mold, she found a rectangle of brass no larger than her palm. Moss covered one corner. She rubbed it away with her sleeve. A 5-pointed star had been cut into the metal. Beneath it, Ruth Maren, 1878-1956 drawer of brass keeper of measure. There was no grave beneath the marker, only a name that someone had refused to let disappear. Stella remained crouched until the cold reached through her trousers. Back inside, she took the old brass spyglass from its case. The glass was dusty, but unbroken. She cleaned the objective with a square of soft cotton, stepped into the rear doorway, and extended each tube slowly until the instrument reached full length. Then she raised it toward the lake. The image trembled at first. She adjusted the focus. Bare branches sharpened. A distant roof came clear. Beyond it, a white strip of water caught the morning sun. For several seconds, Stella simply looked. The past month returned to her, not as one large rescue, but as individual hands. Mrs. Fenn flattening a $1 bill beneath her palm instead of laughing at the transaction. The woman in Janesville unlocking an old Buick and saying Stella could sleep there until morning. Walter Nelson putting used gloves beside the register without adding them to the ledger. A church pantry volunteer named May pressing 2 apples into Stella's grocery sack after Stella had already said she had enough. None of them had solved her life. Each had made the next hour possible. There may be someone watching who remembers a kindness like that, something small enough that the person who offered it may have forgotten. A ride in bad weather, a meal left quietly at a door, 10 patient minutes when you had run out of your own. What was the kindness someone once gave you when you needed it most? That evening, Stella placed Amos's files, the caliper, the metal, and the closed spyglass beside her sleeping place. The money stayed sealed in its tin beneath the bench. Before lying down, she tucked the letter inside the canvas tool roll. For the first time, the roll felt heavier than anything she owned and lighter than anything she had been carrying. December 3rd brought the first real snow. 5.5 inches settled over the forge roof before dawn, filling the broken skylight frames and laying white weight across metal already bowed between rafters. Stella stood beneath the worst leak with a saucepan catching meltwater and read the roofing chapter in Walter's repair manual 3 times before touching a ladder. The roof measured 26 feet by 62 along the working section. Allowing for overlap and waste, she calculated 19 squares of felt, 32 bundles of cedar shingles for the damaged east slope, and nearly 9 pounds of galvanized roofing nails. Walter checked her figures without correcting them. Then he disappeared into the back of Nelson Hardware and returned with a roofing hatchet whose leather grip had darkened almost black. "My brother's," he said. "He won't need it." Stella understood and did not ask more. The next morning, an older man named Ellis Ward arrived in wool trousers and a canvas coat. He had roofed barns around Walworth County for 40 years and refused the $20 Stella offered. "Buy me coffee when it rains." They worked 11 days. Ellis showed her how to sister a split rafter with straight 2x8 lumber, extending well beyond the damaged section. They snapped chalk lines across new felt, so each course stayed honest, despite the old roof wandering beneath it. Stella learned that roofing nails required neither fury nor hesitation. 1 stroke to set, 1 to drive, 1 to finish. On the 4th afternoon, Ellis pointed with the hatchet. "The nail's proud." Stella raised her hammer. "Pull it." She did. By December 14th, the last shingle was seated. Snow remained in the walnut shadows, but when rain arrived 2 nights later, Stella put the saucepan away. January exposed the chimney. With the stove working daily, heat revealed what cold weather had hidden. Several bricks above the roofline had begun spalling, their fired faces breaking loose in thin shells. Mortar near the flashing powdered under Stella's thumb. Walter sold her hydraulic lime and a small sack of fire clay. For the joints nearest the flue, she mixed 3 parts hydraulic lime mortar to 1 part fire clay, adding water slowly until the mortar would hold on a trowel turned nearly vertical. She raked failed joints to sound material, brushed out dust, dampened the brick, and packed each joint firmly from the back outward. January stayed mostly in the 20s. Stella discovered that masonry work in cold weather had its own clock. She warmed small batches indoors and carried them up in a covered bucket. Every 15 minutes she climbed down because her bare fingertips had gone numb again. Gloves protected skin, but stole too much feeling. So she worked barehanded until sensation faded, warmed both hands around the stovepipe, then climbed again. 3 weeks passed that way. 3. On January 27th, with the repaired crown protected and the mortar properly set, she built a test fire from dry oak. She stood outside first. Smoke rose vertically from the chimney, pale against a blue morning. Inside, no gray ribbon slipped from the joints, No smoke curled from behind the stove collar, the draft pulled clean. Stella added one log and watched the flame bend toward the throat. Nothing else needed saying. The floors began late that same week. Under decades of grime, the front room was laid in wide white pine planks, fastened with hand-cut rose-head nails. Several boards near the door were beyond saving, but most remained thick enough to restore. Stella rented Walter's random orbit sander for $14 per day. The first pass used 80 grit paper and removed soot, old finish, and the gray surface fibers lifted by years of damp. The second, at 120 grit, erased the harshest sanding marks. She nearly stopped there, but Walter's manual insisted that patience at the final stage was visible forever. She went over every plank again with 220 dust-coated her hair and settled inside her sleeves. She vacuumed twice, wiped the floor with a barely damp cloth, then brushed on the first oil coat along the grain. 2 more followed, with careful drying between them. After the third coat, she left the room untouched for 48 hours. The wood changed slowly. What had looked almost black became deep honey, then darker still, where the oil entered old grain, until the widest boards approached mahogany in the evening light. One morning during the work, Stella woke before dawn and could not make herself pick up the sander. She carried coffee to the marsh instead. A great blue heron stood in shallow water with its neck drawn close, motionless except when the wind disturbed its breast feathers. Stella watched it for more than an hour. She returned to the forge after noon, ate bread beside the stove, and did no work at all. The next morning, she finished the final sanding pass. February belonged to glass. There were 8 windows in the forge. 3 had no glass left. 4 were cracked badly enough to admit rain. The 8th contained one old pane, whose waviness distorted the walnut trees as though they stood beneath water. Walter examined it from both sides. Leave that one. Stella did. They could not prove the pane had been installed in 1788, but an old property inventory in the county file identified it as the earliest surviving glass associated with the original structure. Stella removed the sash, cleaned the surrounding wood, and preserved the pane exactly where it was. The other windows required patient repetition. She removed hardened glazing with a narrow putty knife, careful not to scar the wood. New glass rested against small glazing points. Stella warmed DAP 33 putty in her hands before rolling it into ropes and pressing it into the rabbet. Her first bevel looked terrible. Walter scraped half of it away. Hold the knife lower. The second line was cleaner. By the 4th window, the putty formed a smooth, angled face that shed water outward, rather than collecting it against the sash. Several counterweight cords had rotted entirely. Stella replaced them with 1/4-inch cotton sash cord. She lowered each weight into its pocket, threaded the cord over the pulley, and secured it with a figure-8 knot before seating it in the sash groove. The first repaired window slammed shut. The second stayed wherever she placed it. She learned from that difference. On the last afternoon, Stella raised the final sash halfway and tested its balance with 2 fingers. It held. Outside, February light lay thin over the marsh. A chickadee landed on a bare walnut branch less than 6 feet from the glass. Its black cap tilted toward her. Small claws closed around the branch, and for several seconds, neither of them moved. Then the bird flew toward the creek. Stella lowered the sash gently and wiped one thumbprint from the new pane. By late February, the walls had become Stella's next argument with the building. The original plaster was horsehair lime laid over hand-split oak lath. Near the chimney, 3 patches failed in succession. The first sagged overnight. The second cracked because Stella hurried the drying. The third detached in one complete piece and landed on the floor like a broken plate. Walter found an old paper sack of clean horsehair in his storeroom. Been here longer than you have. Stella mixed it into fresh lime plaster, pressing the first scored scratch coat firmly between the lath, so keys formed behind the wood. The brown coat went on roughly 3/8 of an inch thick and cured for 72 hours. She misted it whenever the surface dried too quickly. The finished coat was barely 1/8 inch. This time, no cracks appeared. She ran her palm over the cured wall. These patches will hold another 100 years. Doris began leaving food at the door before Stella knew anyone had noticed how little she bought. Doris Pell owned Bayview Cafe and wore red-framed glasses attached to a chain of tiny wooden beads. Every few mornings, Stella found a folded paper bag beside the forge entrance. 2 biscuits, soup in a wax carton, sometimes the end pieces of a pie. The first time Stella carried money into the cafe, Doris pushed her hand away. "Pay me in candles when the shop reopens." Stella had never said the shop would reopen. She put the money back into her pocket. Caleb Finch appeared one Saturday on a blue Schwinn bicycle with a splitting maul balanced awkwardly across the handlebars. He was 16, freckled, and so tall his wrists extended beyond his coat sleeves. Without introduction, he began splitting the pile of storm-fallen walnut behind the forge. Stella offered him $5. He shook his head. "My mother said, 'About your grandfather.'" That was all he explained. By dusk he had stacked enough firewood for several weeks, climbed onto his bicycle, and rode home with the maul across one shoulder. Reverend Boyd came by differently. He was a narrow man with a gray felt hat who walked the road every morning at 7:30. He never entered unless invited. He simply tipped 2 fingers to the brim when Stella was outside. One morning, after seeing her struggle to lift a salvage sash, he carried it inside without comment. Before leaving, he paused at the doorway. "Keep her warm, Lord." 4 words. Then he resumed his walk. The cellar had waited because Stella did not trust the steps. She finally went down on February 11th, 7. Granite treads descended beneath a plank door near the rear workroom. Each step dipped slightly at the center from generations of feet. At the bottom lay a 12 by 15-foot fieldstone floor, dry except for a dark crescent near the north wall. At its center was one dressed granite slab. A small symbol had been carved into it, a circle crossed by a long, narrow line, like the profile of a telescope tube passing through a drawing die. Stella cleaned the mark with a brush. She did not lift the stone. She had learned by then that curiosity did not require immediate obedience. Under the 3rd granite step, however, something moved when she swept away cobwebs. An oak box had been wedged into the cavity. Inside lay a brass key and 1 tintype. The key's bow had been filed into the same circle and tube symbol carved into the cellar stone. The photograph showed a young woman standing outside the forge in 1903. She wore a dark skirt and white work blouse and held a long brass mandrel in one hand. Stella stared at the woman's face. The mouth was narrower. The hair was different. Everything else felt uncomfortably familiar. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written, "Ruth Maren, daughter of Thomas, age 25, summer of 1903. Stella carried the key upstairs. It stayed on the mantel. She did not know what it opened, and for once she found that she could live comfortably beside an unanswered question. March loosened the edges of winter. Snow retreated first from the south wall, then from beneath the walnut trees. The creek behind the marsh grew loud enough to hear from inside the forge. By April, green catkins hung from the walnuts and pollen gathered along the windowsills. Stella had repaired enough to begin practicing the old trade. She chose not to. She bought small sheets of cartridge brass instead, and decided she would spend 1 coin's worth at a time learning what her hands did not yet know. No full telescope tube. No attempt to prove that inheritance had made her skilled. First came sample cups, short sleeves, failed draws, measurements written in pencil. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, on December 8, 2024, Stella completed her first full telescope tube. It had taken 7 attempts. The first buckled near the die. The second carried a faint longitudinal scar. The fourth measured beautifully at one end and wandered 6/1000ths of an inch at the other. Stella kept every failure on a shelf above the bench. The 7th began as cartridge brass annealed under low light, until its surface reached the dull red Amos had described. She drew it in modest reductions, stopping between passes, cleaning the die, measuring only after the metal had rested. At the final draw, the tube emerged straight. Stella rolled it across the old stone inspection surface. No daylight appeared beneath it. She fitted the nested sections, applied the smallest trace of beeswax, and extended them. The movement made almost no sound. That was how she knew. The forge around her no longer resembled the condemned building on the county photograph. The white pine floor carried scars but shone warmly beneath oil. 8 windows held the weather outside. The plaster walls were uneven enough to show the hands that repaired them. Walter's brother's hatchet hung beside the chimney. Amos's spyglass occupied a shelf above the drawing bench. Nothing had been made new merely to look new. The building had been kept. The brass key remained on the mantel until the following spring. Its answer came from Caleb. He was helping Stella remove deadwood from the oldest walnut behind the forge when his pruning saw struck metal beneath a fold of bark. They stopped. Nearly 9 feet above the ground, a small brass plate had been fastened to the trunk decades earlier. The tree had grown around its edges until only a narrow crescent remained visible. Stella climbed the orchard ladder and cleaned away loose bark without cutting living wood. At the center of the plate was the circle and tube mark. Below it was a keyhole. The key turned once. A narrow brass cylinder slid from a cavity protected inside the old plate, sealed at both ends with waxed cork. Stella opened it at the drawing bench. Inside was a folded 48-star American flag, no larger than a handkerchief, and a sheet of paper written in the same disciplined hand she had seen on the back of the tintype. November 11, 1918, Ruth Maren had written it on the day the armistice ended the fighting of the First World War. She wrote that the forge whistle had sounded at 11 that morning, though there had been almost no work to stop. She wrote of Daniel coming home, if transport and God allowed, and William not coming home at all. She wrote that women had kept the drawing benches moving while men were overseas, and that some customers would prefer to forget this once peace returned. So she had hidden one small flag, not to claim a victory, to mark who had waited. At the bottom was a sentence addressed to whoever eventually opened the cylinder. If they tell you the work belonged only to the names printed on the invoices, look at the hands. Stella folded the paper along its old line. The granite slab in the cellar remained untouched. Whatever it covered could continue waiting. The metal from the iron carriage required a different decision. On November 11, 2025, Stella carried it to Oak Hill Cemetery in nearby Lake Geneva, a real Walworth County cemetery established in 1880. There was no public ceremony. She had arranged a small archival box and a plain card bearing Daniel Maren's name, service years, and the family record of William's death in France. She stood among the autumn trees on Veterans Day, held the medal once by its faded ribbon, then placed it with the family memorial papers she had prepared. The gesture lasted less than a minute. It was enough. The money caused less change than anyone might have expected. During the first year, Stella used none of it. During the second, she sold 4 coins from the cash, 2 of the small gold pieces and 2 common silver dollars. The proceeds bought brass stock, replacement die steel, optical glass, and enough fuel to keep the workroom usable through winter. She wrote each removal into Amos's old ledger. 4 coins. Beside the remaining cash, she placed Ruth's tintype, a copy of Amos's letter, her own measurements, from the failed 7th-inch sleeve that had taught her more than the successful one, and a new envelope. Then she resealed the iron compartment. On the outside of the envelope, she wrote only, "For the next one." The shop reopened without an announcement. Doris made that decision for her. One Monday morning, Stella entered Bayview Cafe and found an index card pinned to the corkboard between a snowplow notice and an advertisement for piano lessons. Brass tube. Repairs Mall optical work ask for Stella at the old Draw Works No. Telephone number. Doris had written beneath it, "She answers mail." Within 6 months, Stella had a mailing list of 43 names. Most wanted ordinary things. A dent removed from an old scope tube, a missing collar reproduced, a draw tube tightened. One retired teacher mailed her a 19th century field glass wrapped in a dish towel and included a note apologizing for its condition. Stella preferred repairs. Broken objects already knew what they needed. Caleb came back in October carrying something under a blanket. By then he was 18, and the Schwinn had been replaced by an old pickup whose passenger door closed only when lifted first. He set the covered object against the front wall. What did you do? Not much. He removed the blanket. It was a hand-carved walnut sign. Caleb had copied the surviving gold letters from the old board over the entrance. Williams Bay. A drawn brass works below them. He had added 2 words in smaller letters. Daughter. Stella looked at him. There were no daughters on the old sign. There should have been. He had carved the ampersand too deeply, and one letter leaned slightly left. Stella ran her thumb along the groove. How much? Caleb gave her the same expression Walter once had. In candles. The sign went above the workroom door, not outside. Stella did not want strangers stopping for a story about the young woman who had bought a condemned building for $1. She wanted customers who had a tube that no longer slid properly, or a fitting that required patient measurement. The forge became useful again. That was enough recognition. On January 3rd, 2026, Stella sat at Amos's desk after closing and took out a sheet of cream paper. She had postponed this longer than the roof, the chimney, or the cellar. The first line came easily because she was borrowing it. My dear one, whoever you are. She stopped there. Then she began again beneath it. She wrote that her name was Stella Maren, that she had once mistaken endurance for obedience, and that at 22 she arrived with less than $40, a tool roll, and no idea how to rebuild a chimney. She did not explain her mother. Some inheritances did not need preservation. She wrote instead about Walter's ledger, Doris's paper bags, Caleb's badly carved ampersand, Reverend Boyd's 4-word prayer, and a heron that once persuaded her to waste an entire day. She recorded the dimensions of the dies she had remade. She explained which roof valley still needed watching after heavy snow. She warned that the 3rd stair to the cellar remained slightly loose. Then she described the first successful telescope tube, not as proof, as instruction. At the bottom, she'd left several blank pages for measurements that had not yet been discovered. That evening, she took Amos's restored spyglass outside. A dry January cold had cleared the sky above Geneva Lake. The observatory dome was visible through bare branches, pale against the dark. Stella extended the brass tubes until each section seated gently. She found Jupiter first, then 3 of its moons. Her hands were steady. Sometimes you have to break your own world to see the stars clearly. She lowered the spyglass and stood beside the walnut tree until cold entered her sleeves. Inside, the stove held one careful fire. A repaired sash reflected lamplight. The drawing bench waited beneath its rack of dies, neither museum piece nor monument. Tomorrow there would be a collar to finish for a school telescope in Iowa. There would be brass to anneal. There would be measurements to take twice. Stella went in and closed the door against the wind. The brass telescope tube forge waits. It has always waited. At the county office, Margaret Finn had retired the previous summer. Before leaving, she emptied most of her desk. She kept one thing in the shallow top drawer for her replacement to find: a worn dollar bill, folded twice, clipped to an old transfer receipt. Across the receipt, in Mrs. Finn's blue handwriting, were 5 words: "Do not put this in cash." The dollar remained there, waiting for the next impossible deed.